Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel BethChatsBooks. Now today is going to be my Goodreads Summer Readathon wrap up part 1. So I'm basically going to discuss the books that I read on holiday and a book that I read just before holiday and then one that I read on audiobook kind of in the last day of my holiday. And do all that together. I'm currently still reading for the Goodreads Summer Readathon. Unfortunately, I am part of the kind of discussion board on Instagram Messenger, the direct message with everybody else, but I haven't been following the themes as per week. I just wrote down all the themes and then I kind of read some of the books on holiday. So I'm not in chronological order at all. I would recommend that you go to the Wordaholics page down below and follow if you still want to do it and you kind of want to do it based on their weeks. I know we're on week 3 or 4 now, I believe. And each week is a theme. For example, we've had the less than 100 pages one. We've had one that's always been on your to be read shelf. And I forgot what this week's is, but I've kind of done them higgledy-piggledy. But, you know, I'm still involved. So I'm going to do that video for you now. The lovely Charles Heathcote, who I'll link down below, a beautiful, beautiful booktuber and human. Please go and check him out. He has tagged me recently in a book tag, which I can't remember for the life of me right this second. But I'm planning to do that video this week, film it, so I can at least get that done. So I'm either going to upload it this week or next week. And obviously then I'll do the Goodreads part 2 once I get further into those books. And then I haven't really forgotten either that I'm kind of going to do a video about it being my second year on BookTube. I think I might do a Q&A, so if you're interested, let me know down below. I know that some people have commented on my last video and said it'd be nice to celebrate it with me, so I do like doing those kind of videos. They're always fun, and I can extend that and kind of get you guys to give me some answers. So if you're interested, let me know as soon as possible so that I can then do a quick video releasing the time period that you can ask me questions either on Instagram, Twitter, or here on BookTube. So without further ado, because it's probably going to take a while, I'm going to get into the books that I read. So the first one, it's left at my boyfriend's house because I stayed overnight and I finished it overnight just before we flew in the morning to Montenegro, and that is Revolting Prostitutes, The Fight for Sex Workers' Rights by Molly Smith and Juno Mack. Now, I ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a very interesting look at prostitution. So it doesn't go into the moralistic argument of whether we agree with prostitution, and it doesn't go into a kind of overly feminist argument either about whether it's right that women should use their bodies and whether this is all an ethical thing to do as a woman. It doesn't really go into that. What it looks at, which I found very fascinating, is kind of the idea of, for a second, just ignore this argument of whether we can have prostitutes or we can't, or we should or we shouldn't. We have them. So why don't we look at sex work instead of looking at predominantly from sex, which has been massively oversaturated in the media and in the political argument of it's sex, and then the argument around pleasure or not. This book, Juno and Molly say, why don't we just look at it from a workers' rights point of view and look at sex work as actual work, the same as we look at teachers having a union and their rights. Then let's look at things like borders. So it does a chapter on borders and how that's affecting sex workers. So it's affecting legal sex workers, but it's also affecting illegal sex workers, and the idea that people who don't have documentation or the documentation is not valid by certain people or they can't get access to it and they need to migrate to another country to basically have any quality of life for their family, and how that affects them, how our border control is a relatively new concept, and how we are using that and how it's affecting both illegal and illegal sex workers and how it's further pushing them into exploitation. For example, people without documented papers are going to people and asking for ridiculous loans to get across the border, which then they are expected to repay back in the country that they enter, either through sex work or through manual labour or through kind of waitressing, for example, and they are paid very little and the debt is very, very high and they spend most of their life just trying to pay that back. Or they have abuse from these people who are helping them cross the border, and then they're more likely to end up with pimps and things like that. And then the next kind of section of the book deals with all the different legal or illegal statuses of prostitution throughout the world. So we have the Norwegian model, which is where I think if I remember correctly, because there was quite a few things going on, I think that's where people who buy sex are meant to be prosecuted, but prostitutes themselves aren't. However, they went into a lot of detail about how this affects prostitutes in a negative way, because then the people that they are trying to use as customers, they're less likely to keep going to prostitutes. So only a kind of rare percentage will still use prostitutes, and those people are more likely to exploit prostitutes. For example, take them to the middle of nowhere, expect sex without any protection, be abusive, and how because prostitutes don't have that resource, a lot of customers anymore, because of the fact that customers are prosecuted, they have to go with these people that they know are potentially going to be a lot more dangerous clientele. We then have, obviously, partly criminalised, which is the UK, where you can't basically advertise or solicit or help prostitution. The actual act of prostitution itself isn't illegal, but selling it is. We have fully criminalised. Then we have legislation, which is kind of... Legislation and decriminalisation are slightly different. So legislation means that you can perform prostitution or sell it or advertise it in a set area, and that if you go outside of that area, it's classed as illegal. So they had like prostitute places as such. And then decriminalisation is where it's fully legalised and everybody's selling it, customers, prostitutes, it's all absolutely legal. So what slightly let the book down, but not marginally, is that this issue is very complex. So they raised these amazing points about it, and then they kind of said that decriminalisation is the best place for us to go. It doesn't mean at the moment that, for example, people who are not documented and migrant workers and illegal prostitutes are not being protected when it's still decriminalised, because they have no rights anyway as a person, so they can't join these unions because they're not classed as a citizen. So they were saying, obviously, we're not saying that that eradicates the problem, but that's where we want to head, because that seems to be the best out of all the options at the moment. So obviously it was quite frustrating towards the end of the book, because some of the ideas are really good, but how to create a world in which every single prostitute is protected is obviously not going to happen, and it's certainly not going to happen overnight. So it's hard, because you kind of feel for all these women, and it's going to be a really slow process. But I really loved how this book raised awareness. For example, I would class myself as someone who is pro-feminism and pro-women's rights, but I never really considered the rights of prostitutes. And that's just an honest depiction. I'd always kind of never really thought about prostitution and the reasons why women get into prostitution and the reason they're exploited in prostitution. And it kind of made me check myself and realise that their rights are just as important, and their stories are just as important, and what they have endured and put up with for money for their families, not because they're sex crazy or because they enjoy prostitution. It really made me acknowledge a group of people that I hadn't really given enough credit to. I hadn't read their stories enough, so I would encourage every single woman, whether you're a feminist or not, to read it, because it's so enlightening on that topic, and it really made me very invigorated and interested in prostitutes' rights. And also it's really interesting because it's from the point of view of people who were almost saying how prostitution and sex workers, pro-sex worker and workers' rights, has not always gone along with feminism, and feminists have not actually really been supportive of it. So it opened my eyes just so much. So basically that was a whole load of blur, but it is such a fantastic book, so interesting. So I had to give it 5 stars, because usually I don't connect as well with non-fiction, but this was definitely an exception to the rule. And like I said, obviously the overall argument was a bit frustrating at the end, but it's such a complex issue. It's like if we were talking about American politics, or we were discussing our politics, or kind of something like climate change, something that's just so big that one book is not going to be able to give you the definitive answer, but it certainly opens up the table for discussion on this issue, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It definitely encouraged me to actually read a lot more into this topic. So there's that one. Sorry, that was rather waffly. And then the next one we're going on to is Stay With Me by Adebami Adebayo. Now, this was a really stunning book. So I think I gave this 4.5. I believe it was a 4.5. So this book ended up being one of my favourites of the 3 I read on holiday, I would say so. Glancing. Yeah, definitely. So this one deals with the characters Yajidi and Akin. So this book was really, really interesting. I had a lot of plot turns. So Yejide, they live in Nigeria and she's married to him, and it kind of goes through how they first met. And then she has some issues becoming pregnant. She has a phantom pregnancy, and everybody's very concerned. And then Akin's family start getting involved, and in particularly Yehide's mother-in-law, and she brings a new wife to the family. Now what's interesting is, based on the blurb, I thought that was going to be the predominant story. This book has an absolute gift at, there were so many turns and twists, and I kind of thought, oh, it'll exhaust itself out, this book, but it didn't. So in a weird way, that kind of plot line, which is sold as the big plot line of how's Yejide going to deal with this new wife, doesn't actually take up a lot of the book. It then starts following and really scrutinising Yejide's and Akin's relationship. Then we kind of get a third dynamic, because we get introduced to Akin's brother, which I'm not going to spoil. But this is more of a book that kind of takes a look at motherhood and the desire for motherhood and this complex relationship. There's a bit at the end as well, which I don't want to spoil for you, but it broke my heart for her, because all through the book we know how passionate she is about wanting to be a mother. And I can't really spoil it, can I? Oh, it's just beautiful. I didn't give it a full 5 stars because I remember reading it. With me, it's a feeling. I've said this many times, and I have to have the feeling in the first 100 pages, I feel, to really give it. Otherwise, if I'm finishing it going, then usually it will most times be a 4 out of 5 or a 4.5 out of 5. So this one is stunning. It is really interesting culturally how they deal with things like infertility and issues around that, especially with the different sexes. That's all I'm going to say, because I don't want to give any spoilers either, but the attitude between women infertility versus male infertility. And then there's an intricate look at relationships, and heartbreakingly how there's a strong bond between mother and child, and maybe not as strong of a bond between husband and wife. Again, I'm really skirting around these spoilers, but it's absolutely stunning. I think I read this in one day. When I was away with Paul, he kept commenting. He said, you and this book, you're glued to it. You read it so fast. And then when I started the second book, he realised it was a lot slower. So, you know, he acknowledged that I really got into this. I raced through it, and anything else she writes, considering I think this was her debut, it was fantastic. I really invested in these characters, and I was heartbroken at many instances for her and the situation, but it's a real romp. It's not a thriller, not remotely, but it has that romp kind of element. You want to keep finding out what's happening, and it keeps surprising you, and you keep thinking in your head, how can she carry on this? She's already done a twist and a turn, and we've already got so far into this book. But for example, I was halfway and thinking, how can she carry on this book? You know, I thought this was the main bit, and then we moved to something else. I thought this was the main bit. But all the characters get an equal voice and an equal opportunity to speak in this, which I really liked. And you definitely, while you're in it, connect with all these characters. So yeah, 4.5 out of 5. It was fantastic. And then the next one I read was The Glorious Heresies by Lisa McInerney. Now, I think I gave this one just a straightforward 4, because like I said, Paul noticed that it took me a while to get into this one. Now, once I did get into this, I thoroughly enjoyed it, but it was completely different to the other book. And what I did is I picked books on purpose that were set in different places, different kind of storyline, because I think you want pure escapism when you're away on holiday. And I did definitely get that with picking these 3 books. So this is about, we start with Maureen. She's recently got back in contact with her estranged adult son, Jimmy. And she's staying in a house he's kind of set her up with, which we later find out used to be a kind of prostitute, whorehouse place. I don't know how else to call it, where obviously he pimped out a lot of people. But Maureen doesn't know that. She moves in, and then one day, I forgot his name now, but a guy turns up at Maureen's house. She thinks he's an intruder. He's basically gone back because he had a relationship with one of the prostitutes, and she'd left something behind in the place. So he went to go and collect that for her, which is kind of a religious ribbony symbol thing. I'm not very clued up with Catholicism, so I didn't understand its significance while I was reading the book. But anyway, So he goes to collect that for her. Maureen spots him. She hits him over the head with a statue of Mary, I believe. And so Jimmy entrusts the help of his friend Tony, who he knew in the past, to help him get rid of this body. We know Jimmy's a prolific gangster in the area. And then we know that Tony's son Ryan gets caught up in everything. And then Ryan ends up being reconnected throughout the book back to the prostitute girlfriend called Georgie, who he kind of meets along the way. He sells drugs to her, they have a relationship, and Georgie comes full circle, visits this property again, and has a brief contact with Maureen in this book. So the whole idea is that we kind of stem through all these characters and come back together. We do hear from Jimmy's point of view, we do hear from Maureen's, Ryan's and Georgie's. This was quite a sad book really overall. Everybody was kind of deplorable, but in a pathetic and heart-wrenching way because of their circumstances and their situation. So for example, Maureen had a very tragic story. She was forced to give up Jimmy. When she was pregnant with him, it was a time in Ireland, I think it was the 70s and 80s or 70s, 60s, where she wasn't basically allowed to keep him. They thought that having a child out of wedlock was disgraceful, and the Catholic Church kind of took Jimmy away. And then Maureen's parents decided to raise him and they sent her away to London. So that was kind of a sad story of why she couldn't raise Jimmy. Georgie has some horrible moments herself. She gets pregnant and she ends up kind of befriending a Christian cult as such, and they end up taking her baby off her and giving it back to the dad. Ryan, who has so much promise, who's so intelligent, he's had an abusive childhood because Tony's been quite abusive to him. He ends up kind of throwing his potential down the drain a little bit, and he ends up having a bitter relationship with his girlfriend that kind of escalates for the both of them. There's nobody particularly lovely or morally just in this book, so I think that's why it took quite a while to get into it. What I loved about this book, however, was that there's a real dark humour to it. So there's things that are quite difficult to read in here, but there's always that hint of sarcastic dark humour, which I loved. And these characters, I don't necessarily have to agree with a character and their choices or their overall character to enjoy a book. So I did enjoy this because although it was a little bit depressing at points, whereas to some extent Stay With Me also was, so I can't really say anything on that front. And I also sometimes like a depressing or a sad or a dark story because I get really invested. So it didn't really detract from me. I did connect with them. I loved that they all had kind of an element of a sad story to them. So you absolutely managed to sympathise with every single character, even Jimmy, who's probably the worst of all of them. You managed to kind of understand the circumstances around it. So I've probably given a little bit much more away than this one than I did with Stay With Me. But it's interesting because I believe that both of these were Bailey's Prize winners, so it's really interesting to see how completely different they were, and I think they were a year apart from each other, so that's really interesting. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. It just didn't blow me away as much as Stay With Me, but I know she's written another book and I'd be so intrigued to see how that goes, because her writing style, once I did get into it, was really very, very interesting. So there's that one. And then the final one I read on holiday was Idaho by Emily Rushkovich. And I think I also gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars, between 4 and 4.5, because as I was reading it, I didn't connect as much as I did with Stay With Me, but upon reflection, it's a really beautiful and very interesting story. And I think the only issue that stopped me from giving it a higher rating really was because the ending was very ambiguous, which I didn't want. I was pumped all the way through this book to have a conflict, a battle, to have a confrontation between characters, which I really wanted to happen, to get some kind of closure overall about the story, and it didn't allow me. So this was very much a thriller. So Anne and Wade are married together, and Wade is starting to lose his memory, and it's heartbreaking because he's becoming violent towards Anne. He's completely disorientated and he keeps pushing her head down on things, and at one point there's a really horrific scene in here where he pushes her head down onto broken glass, and it broke my heart. And as soon as I started reading it, I quickly was thinking, is this an abusive relationship? Is she hiding things? Because her narration was so fantastic. However, that didn't escalate. I read this and there was almost a dark energy from the beginning, and I was trying to figure out where it all came from. So then we go back in time. Anne's desperate to find out what happened to Wade's family. So Wade was previously married to a lady called Jenny, and they had children called May and June. And basically what happens is, one day they were going out into the forest to collect wood, and with no kind of trigger warning, Jenny ends up holding the axe in the car, and May's in the car, and June has run off into the forests. And Jenny attacks and kills May with the axe. Then they go back, Jenny's arrested, he tries to go back for June, and she's nowhere to be seen. And I'm really sorry, I've kind of spoiled this already, but it within the first 3 odd chapters you kind of get the gist, so that's not really spoiler-esque because they want you to know that from the beginning. But what's interesting is Anne's trying to know what happened. She's trying to figure out why those circumstances, it kind of happened with no real motivation. So we hear from Jenny's point of view while she's in prison, we hear from Anne's point of view. This book is really good at playing into that desire you have as a reader and not necessarily satisfying you in that area. Also with Jenny, very interesting because you connect with her and you sympathise with her, and you find that really disturbing throughout the reading experience because you realise you're kind of supporting somebody you don't want to. And Wade proves not very helpful in this book, so this book was fantastic because you want so much from it and it teases you right up until the end. It's an utter tease. So I do apologise if I've given loads of spoilers there. It's kind of thriller-esque in that way. It's really fast-paced because you want to know what's going on, but it teases and taunts you with it. So I really enjoyed that. So that was 4.5 out of 5 stars. So the one I read after I came back from holiday was The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. Now I read that in audiobook because I ran out of books and I had like a day and a half left, and I was pretty much reading these within 2 days or a day. So I started to read that. So it had a collection of short stories. So we end up being introduced to famous 2 M's of the story, Mycroft and Moriarty. So we about 2 stories from the end we meet Mycroft, which wasn't particularly interesting. So this overall collection was very similar to the short stories, very similar to the first 2 books, Jean Scarlet and The Sign of 4. The only story that started to really resonate with me was the final one, which was called The Final Problem, which we met Moriarty and started understanding this complex relationship that's going to build. So I believe at the end of The Final Problem, they insinuate heavily that Sherlock's been killed by Moriarty. But I remember from doing a bit of research that he was that popular, Sherlock Holmes, that everybody was very distressed that Arthur Conan Doyle killed him off. So they ended up resurrecting him, and I think that's where this long, renowned relationship between Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes develops, because when I first started reading Sherlock Holmes, I was kind of thinking, well, when are we meeting Moriarty? Because this is the whole premise from all the films and the media, is that these two are the ultimate good guy, bad guy. So we finally meet him. We didn't know a lot about him. We just know he's got similar power to Sherlock and he does it for bad, and that Sherlock was insinuating a lot of the goings on throughout other stories have been connected to people that he knew. So that one was quite interesting, but overall it was very samey to the other ones. So I'm hoping that when I continue with it and begin to read The Hound of the Baskervilles that it'll be slightly different, but I ended up just giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars because it was very similar and it didn't blow my socks off, but it is a great comfort read, and the way that Stephen Fry narrates it makes you very cosy and comfy, and I don't necessarily need a book to always blow me away, so it can just be run-of-the-mill and enjoyable, but obviously it didn't rock my world because I've kind of read quite a lot of the Sherlock series now and it's all been very similar. And then the last one I read was Girls Will Be Girls by Emma O'Toole. So I ended up giving this 4.5 out of 5 stars. I know so many people love it. It's one of their favourite non-fictions. However, some of what she presented in the book I enjoyed, but I didn't necessarily believe it's something that I would do or feel comfortable with, or whether it really raised as much. For example, in Revolting Prostitutes, it raised so much food for thought on the topic, whereas this one seemed to be, to me, very similar to a kind of beginner's feminist look at female rights. So a few things were quite enlightening. She spends a lot of time discussing how things like body hair, the idea that we shave as a woman our body hair, and how the idea that we are shamed about our body through the beauty industry and through society telling us that having hairy legs or hairy armpits is unfeminine. I found that really enlightening because it's something that I hadn't really acknowledged myself as somebody who has to keep plucking and tucking like all those women. I hadn't really acknowledged that we're also we're making a choice, but we're kind of being colluded into this choice through the media and other things. I thought her ideas around gender, sexuality and how it's fluid and how she's often attracted to people who kind of gender bend, which she calls in the book, so it's not an offensive term, was really interesting. I really loved the bits that were kind of slightly like a memoir, where she was telling us her personal experience. She was very witty, very, very witty, and it comes through in the book quite easily. There's a lot of laugh out loud moments, and she's very frightfully honest. She talks about how she kind of went viral for a period of time and was on this morning due to the fact that she grew her body hair, which I thought was hilarious. She was very open about her sexuality, and she gave you so much food for thought on how we are making choices and how as women we can choose to make different choices. I would have liked a bit more evening out in terms of the genders, because I think a lot of books now and non-fiction and things that we consume around the topic of feminism is predominantly about women, and I like to believe that feminism isn't just about women. Men also are colluded into the same things, and recently now there's been a massive surge with media industry of how men have to have a certain physique, and I'm really fascinated personally with men and mental health. I recently did some suicide training at work, and to know that they're in such a high proportion, and that we could find simple techniques to start these conversations with people, I find really interesting. And obviously because male mental health is a lot harder to notify and to deal with than it is with female mental health, and obviously there's more people in the age range of kind of 18 to 30 that are men that are committing suicide. That personally interests me, and I think there's a lot of different debates that we could have about gender and sexuality and include men in this conversation as well, instead of women are being made to do this. Because while this book raised a lot of things about society and agency, how far do we have rights and how far is society putting us into these boxes, I think men with things like hypermasculinity and other things are also being forced similarly to women, and they are learning gendered language just as we're learning gendered language, and they're learning they're a more privileged sex, but not that they're actively making that choice. That the way society is constructed is also damning to them in different ways, and they're growing in ignorance to things. And I think we bring both of the genders in to have that discussion, as well as obviously transgenders. We need to keep having these conversations and including everybody. That's personally my opinion, and I think a lot of these books and like this one, it focuses a lot on women's rights, and while I enjoy it, I acknowledged a lot in that book that was very similar to my own personal experiences. I feel like we can broaden out the conversation a little bit more, so that's why I didn't give it a full 5 stars, but it is such a good read, and I do think women should read it just so that they can kind of connect with some of the very personal issues. So that's that. So currently I'm reading And the Mountains Echoed by Khaled Hosseini. I think I have about 100 pages left of this, or less than that, but I'll do that in part 2 because I'm really, really loving this book, and I think I'll have quite a lot to say, and I've already said too much on this video as it is. So that is everything for my Goodreads Summer Readathon Part 1 wrap up. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.